In this lecture, we're going to take the time to review the router configuration generated by the CLI. In your editor, open the main.js file inside the source directory. This file is where the configuration begins. The View Router module comes packaged in the form of a plugin. If you want to use it, you'll need to import it. At the top, with the other import statements, a file called router is being imported. We'll look at the contents of this file in a moment, but let's see where it's used. Down below, we're calling the use function. It's being passed in the router object. We can deduce that the settings are configured in a separate file for organization purposes. Let's open the router file next. It's the index.js file inside the router directory. Three things are being imported. The first two are the functions createRouter and createWebHistory. The third thing is the home component. The home component can be found inside the views directory. We'll look at it soon. We're going to ignore it at the moment. We want to focus on how the router is being configured. A variable called router is being defined. Its value is the object returned by the createRouter function. The object returned comes with methods, properties, and components that we can use in our application. This object gets exported in the file. It's the object that's being used to register a new plugin in the main.js file. This plugin will expose the methods and properties for interacting with the router. Back in the router configuration file, the function has one argument, which is an object of configuration settings. Let's go through them one by one. The first setting is the history. We can use this option to enable history mode in the browser. Most of the latest browsers come with an API called the History API. It lets you interact with the browser history. You can use it to change the URL in the address bar without having to refresh the page. The value for this must be an object with how we plan to use the History API to navigate the app. There are a lot of things we need to account for when using the History API. Luckily, the View Router library has a helper function for helping you generate the object. The value for this property is being set to the createWebHistory function. It'll take care of generating the object. It does require we pass in a base URL. This will represent the base URL for our application. The View Router library will take care of appending the URLs to the base URL. This feature saves us time from having to type out the full URL constantly. We can focus on the paths. In addition, it's important to set in case your application is inside a nested directory. Not all applications are hosted in the root document. For this project, we're using a property called import.meta.environment.baseURL. The import.meta object contains information on the current module. Through this object, we can access info on the current environment. That info can be accessed by looking inside the environment property. env is short for environment. We're accessing the base URL property. The base URL property can be configured through the vite configuration file. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a documentation page with more info on this process. We don't have to change this since the default works fine for us already. Our server can be accessed by navigating to localhost. We don't have to worry about adding additional directories. The next property is the routes. This property will be an array of paths a user can access in our application. 2 routes have been created for our application. These are just examples to help you get started. We're going to create our routes from scratch. Empty the routes arrays. The home component isn't being used anymore. We can safely remove the import statement for it. I prefer to outsource my routes to a variable for better manageability. This step is optional. Above the router variable, define an empty array called routes. Next, update the configuration object with this variable. The last thing that happens in this file is the router object is exported. The exported object is what's registered in the view instance. This object will enable routing for the application. In the next set of lectures, we're going to begin creating some routes.